Okay, this is going to be basically what I spoke at a conference at Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies some months ago, but this is for those of you who were not present for that. So indeed, the map is not the territory, is my topic, and mapping hermeneutic approaches to the Bhagavatam's cosmology is the more specific intention. So I start with a quote from the Bhagavatam, the fifth canto. This is from chapter 16, verse 21. The mud on both banks of the river Jambu Nadi, being moistened by the flowing juice and then dried by the air and the sunshine, produces huge quantities of gold called Jambu Nada. The denizens of heaven use this gold for various kinds of ornaments. Therefore, all the inhabitants of the heavenly planets and their youthful wives are fully decorated with golden helmets, bangles, and belts, and thus they enjoy life. Well, that's very nice. We hear this description, but what do we understand from it? And so I want to bring in this rather famous phrase from Polish-American philosopher of the 20th century, Alfred Korzybski. And I think this little diagram gives the basic idea of what he's saying. We start perhaps on the left with reality as such. We perceive it with our senses, which have constraints, and we understand are imperfect. From that, we get some understanding, and from that, there are filters, and then all of this might be articulated in some form or another, and we can call it a graph, a map, broadly speaking. So 2 questions I'm wanting to address. What is the relation between the Bhagavata's descriptions in written form, that is, linguistic representations, and the actualities out there that the text describes? It tells us that these are actualities somewhere in the universe. But another question is, what is the relation of attempts at mapping hermeneutical, that is, interpretive approaches to the first question, to any actual interpretive practices, or to the conceptualizing of such interpretive practices? So this is a kind of second order reflection on what the process of interpretation is all about. Hermeneutics 108, of course, I'm speaking about Western hermeneutics here. And a short definition, hermeneutics is the art of practice of interpretation. Okay. We have a list here of 5 prominent Western philosophers of hermeneutics. I think all of them are German except one French, Paul Ricoeur. And my interest goes specifically and especially to the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer. He creates, or he establishes, a philosophical framework that recognizes complexity of interpretation and of understanding. And more specifically, he's interested in the notion of dialogue, and he wants interpretation to be a reflexive process, which means reflecting on oneself as one is engaged in the process. And he wants to acknowledge the role of our biases and the traditions with which we come to any interpretation, especially of a text, and usually of a religious text. And he wants to do this while seeking to bridge the gap between, well, he calls them horizons, our horizon and the horizon of others. To explain all of this, he writes extensively, and of course, there's no time here to elaborate. But I want to suggest three general categories, which Gadamer talks about, three types of hermeneutics. Broadly speaking, there's the hermeneutics of consent, there's the hermeneutics of suspicion, and what Gadamer calls integrative hermeneutics. And I want to unpack these briefly. And we'll start with the Bhagavata's hermeneutics of consent. And as an example of this, I'm taking a quote from a very traditional acharya of the Madhva Sampradaya, Vijayadvaja. So, the words of Vyasa, an ocean of infinite wisdom, cannot be doubted. And according to him, quote, details regarding the world, the earth's sheaths, should be taken as per the Bhagavatam. Any other text, in case of contradiction, should be reconciled as required. So that's, you can say, consenting to the statements of Shastra. He goes on to say, and this is in response to a verse which comes one or two verses earlier in the passage that I was reading, where it says that these jambu fruits are the size of elephants. So now he wants to explain the size of an elephant is meant to perceive the fullness and not actual dimension. So we may breathe easily. We may think, oh, okay, so it's figurative. But then he goes on to say the actual size is mentioned in the Vayu Purana as, quote, sages who directly and truly perceive entities, that is, Rishibi Tattva Darshibi, have told the fruit to be 861 aratnis. What's an aratni? It's the distance from the elbow to the fingertip in size. Multiplied by 861, and you have something like 4 football field lengths. Okay, elephants that size. That's what the acharyas say. That's what the Vayu Purana says. Right. Well, this sounds like a kind of literalism in the Bhagavatam, and one might be concerned that this is what's called in philosophy naive realism. Well, but you can say, anyway, it's poetry. It's all written in poetic language. But the claim could be made from a consent, hermeneutics of consent position, that, well, what we're saying here is that the map is the territory. Well, there are examples of multiple interpretations in the Bhagavatam. I would point out Sanatana Goswami's Brihad Vaishnav Toshni commentary on the 10th canto. I would also point out Bhaktivinoda Thakur's allegorical interpretations of Krishna's childhood demon-killing leelas, but he does not deny their literal meaning. He adds the allegorical meaning. Okay, then we can look at Richard Thompson's acknowledgement in his book, The Mysteries of the Sacred Universe. There are multiple versions and variations of cosmology and cosmography in the various Puranas, in the Mahabharata, and in Jain and Buddhist texts. He acknowledges this. So we may say, okay, traditional Shastric hermeneutics to the rescue. In the Vedanta Sutra, the Brahma Sutra, Tattu Samanvayat, Lord Krishna is the conclusion because of the totality of all scriptural statements. And so we might go back to Gadamer in his process of interpretation and see how we're reading, interpreting, reading further, interpreting, continuing this process of part and whole analysis. This may bring us to some understanding. And if we take it that, yes, we're putting Krishna in the center of the circle of hermeneutic interpretation, or we're putting him across the horizon, and thus we come to a proper understanding, possibly. Well, let's move on now to the hermeneutics of suspicion. This was coined by Paul Ricoeur. The famous three masters of suspicion, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche, are well-known figures. And the basic idea of hermeneutics of suspicion is that the straightforward meanings of texts is regarded as deceptive or self-deceptive. Explicit texts hide deeper meanings and implications. And this especially is understood to boil down to establishing and maintaining power over and oppression of others. Well, how this might be applied, the hermeneutics of suspicion, I take an excerpt from Patanjali Yoga Sutras, where is described in the third pada the process of samyama and the results. So, for example, we have these three statements. Bhuvana jnanam surye samyamat. By performing samyama on the sun, arises knowledge of the different realms in the universe. And similarly, samyama on the moon, knowledge of the solar systems. Samyama on the pole star, knowledge of movements of stars. Okay, here comes the suspicions. Well, yogic powers may be a hook to entice adherents, part of a cynical marketing scheme for yoga. Yoga offers the promise of power to the powerless. Or there may be a psychological explanation. Yoga powers are an expression of infantile powerlessness, overcoming repressed childhood experiences of powerlessness. And so many more explanations could be suggested. Moving quickly on, we go up to integrative hermeneutics. And here we can consider some of the ideas of Richard Thompson, again in his book, Mysteries of the Sacred Universe. His efforts at mapping the Bhagavatam's fifth canto onto contemporary geographic and cosmographic accounts. And in particular, his notion of the context-sensitive models. He says, in the Bhagavatam, the context-sensitive approach was rendered particularly appropriate by the conviction that reality and the ultimate issue is avak manasam, or beyond the reach of the mundane mind or words. This implies that a literal one-to-one model of reality is unattainable. And so one may as well pack as much meaning as possible into a necessarily incomplete description of the universe. And so in this way, I would say Richard Thompson's affirming this notion that the map is not the territory applies to the Bhagavatam. It is necessarily incomplete, he says. Okay. So he acknowledges figurative language. He uses quotation marks around these two terms, islands and oceans, in referring to the rings of Bhumandala. And so he says the geography of Bhumandala encodes a combination of astronomical and geographical maps, which is both rational and scientific. And he says it appears that this geography is introduced or adapted to convey a number of meaningful messages, some of which may still remain obscure. And this process may be linked to, says Richard Thompson, the historical development of Purana cosmology. Again, we have three hermeneutics styles: hermeneutics of consent, of suspicion, and integrative hermeneutics. There's a fourth option, which I want to share, I want to suggest, extending integrative hermeneutics. And this is the thinking of Dr. Jessica Frazier, who is a lecturer in theology and religion at Trinity College, Oxford. And she suggests, and it's interesting, by the way, she wrote her doctoral dissertation on Gadamer and Rupa Goswami. She got them speaking to each other, so to say. She suggests, rather than dialogue, which was Gadamer's idea, between two supposedly disparate worldviews, what may be called for is what she calls triangulation of multiple voices, what she calls choral hermeneutics. Now, we want to apply this, I want to suggest, to interpreting the Bhagavatam. And I've suggested here with this simple diagram that we may have four sorts of orientations that we need to take into account in interpreting the Bhagavatam, including interpreting about jambu fruits falling and becoming gold mixed with water of juice and mud and so on. And it gets more complicated when we add the particulars, the specifics of non-Indic traditions, of our current readers, and of course, our Vedic corpus and the commentarial tradition, or one should perhaps say commentarial traditions. So just to kind of bring this together briefly, I'm suggesting that at least using Western thought about hermeneutics, we consider this idea that the map is not the territory. There is the hermeneutics of consent, but what did this hermeneutics of consent lead us to? To picture jambu fruits, which are the size of 4 football fields. The hermeneutics of suspicion is there, and I want to point out the Bhagavatam also uses the hermeneutics of suspicion, applying it to materialistic worldviews. And then we have integrative hermeneutics of Richard Thompson's analysis in the mysteries of the sacred universe. What Jessica Frazier calls choral hermeneutics may also be something we need to consider as an option if we're going to do comprehensive hermeneutics of the Bhagavatam. Srila Prabhupada said in his commentary to the verse which I quoted, "It is understood that in a higher planetary system in this material world, the mud on the banks of the Jambu Nadi mixes with Jambu juice, reacts with the sunshine in the air, and automatically produces huge quantities of gold." To me, that leaves many questions unanswered. It is understood by whom and how. So this leaves me with questions, and I hope it leaves you with some thoughts on the subject of hermeneutics of the Bhagavatam. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much, Krishna Kshetra.